There are 12 seconds of silence in the Tonight Show archives that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. 12 seconds. On live television. With 22 million people watching. The cameras were rolling. The studio orchestra had gone quiet. Ed McMahon had stopped breathing, or so it seemed. And Dean Martin, the man who had made an entire generation believe that life was one long, beautiful joke, was sitting across from Johnny Carson with an expression that nobody in that studio had ever seen on his face before. Not anger. Not grief. Something older than both. Something that looked, to the camera operator who zoomed in without being told to, like a man who had just been asked a question he already knew the answer to. And the answer was unbearable. What Johnny Carson asked that night was not on any note card. It was not rehearsed, not approved, not cleared by any producer. It came from somewhere instinctive, the place where real conversations live, beneath the performance, beneath the format, beneath 22 years of friendship built on the understanding that some things you simply do not say out loud. Johnny said it anyway. And Dean Martin whispered something back. 4 words. So quiet that only the microphone caught them. So quiet that the audio engineer in the control room had to play the tape back 3 times before he understood what he was hearing. Johnny heard them the first time. And Johnny Carson, the man who had faced down presidents and survived network executives and kept his composure through 30 years of live television, went completely still. What Dean Martin whispered that night ended a 22-year friendship without a single argument.
Before we continue our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you're subscribed. It's free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
Without a single raised voice, without a single goodbye. They would never speak again. But what nobody knew, what nobody would understand for years, was that Dean Martin had not whispered a secret. He had whispered a warning. And it would take 11 more years for the world to understand what he already knew. The year was 1976. The place was NBC Studios, Burbank, California. And everything that was about to happen had roots in a friendship that stretched back so far that neither man could remember exactly where it began. What they both remembered was the feeling of it. The ease of it. Dean Martin and Johnny Carson had known each other since the kind of early that precedes fame. The years when talent is abundant and success is theoretical, and the only currency that matters is who makes you laugh after midnight when the rooms are empty and the pretending can stop. They had that. From the beginning, they had that. Carson always said that Dean was the only man in Hollywood who never performed for him. Not once. Not even the first night they met, at a party in 1954 that neither of them particularly wanted to attend, in a house that smelled like cigarettes and ambition and someone else's money. They ended up on a back porch together, 2 men who had both grown up poor enough to know exactly how thin the line was between the room inside and the dark outside, and they talked for 4 hours about nothing that would ever make headlines. Dean talked about his father, a barber in Steubenville, Ohio, who had worked 6 days a week for 40 years and died without ever seeing his son on television. Johnny talked about his mother. Just briefly. Just enough. They never spoke about that night again. But they both carried it. The way you carry the conversations that happen only once, in the dark, when the guards are down and the truth comes out not because you planned it but because something in the air simply made it possible. For 22 years, that night on the back porch was the bedrock of everything between them. Dean appeared on The Tonight Show 11 times between 1962 and 1975. Each appearance was an event. The ratings spiked. The switchboard lit up. Critics wrote about the chemistry between them as if it were a natural phenomenon, something that could be observed and admired but never manufactured. And the chemistry was real. Because at its core, it was not chemistry at all. It was recognition. 2 men who had built elaborate public selves looking at each other and seeing, clearly and without illusion, what was underneath. They made each other laugh the way only people who genuinely know each other can, not at jokes, but at the absurdity of the whole performance. The cameras, the desk, the applause, the careful maintenance of the image. They could share a single glance across the desk and communicate an entire paragraph of irony about the situation they were both perpetually in. What most people never understood about Dean Martin was the distance between the man and the myth. The relaxed, whiskey-smooth entertainer who seemed to glide through life without effort, that was a construction. A brilliant one. One of the great performances of the 20th century, if you knew enough to look at it that way. But a performance nonetheless. The real Dean Martin was a man who had clawed his way out of a steel town with nothing but nerve and talent, who had survived the collapse of the most famous comedy partnership in the world, who had rebuilt himself from the ground up at an age when most men would have accepted that the ground was where they were going to stay. He was tougher than the image, harder than the smile, and far more private than any television camera had ever been allowed to see. Johnny knew that. It was one of the few things they had never needed to say out loud. There was a version of Dean Martin that existed for the public and a version that existed in private, and the gap between them was not dishonesty, it was survival. Dean had learned early that vulnerability was a currency you spent carefully or not at all. The world had certain expectations of him. He had built a career, a brand, a persona on meeting those expectations so precisely and so effortlessly that the effort itself became invisible. That was the art of it. But it meant that when something real broke through, when the performance slipped and you caught a glimpse of the actual man standing behind it, the contrast was almost physically striking. Like a spotlight cutting through fog. Johnny had seen it happen twice in 22 years. Once on that back porch in 1954. And once on October 14, 1976. That was the friendship. And that was what made the night of October 14, 1976, so devastating. Because it was the last night it existed. Dean Martin arrived at NBC Studios that evening at 4:15 p.m. for a 5:30 p.m. taping. His publicist was with him. His manager was with him. He shook hands with the stage crew, signed autographs for two assistants who had worked up the nerve to ask, and declined the offer of a drink from the green room bar, which was the first thing that made the stage manager, a man named Carl Hendricks, pause. In 11 appearances over 14 years, Dean Martin had never declined a drink from the green room bar. Carl noticed it but said nothing. In the green room, Dean sat with his coffee, also unusual, and looked at something on the table in front of him that nobody else could see. His eyes were focused on a middle distance that had nothing to do with the room he was in. His hands were still. His expression was quiet in a way that a man's expression is quiet when he is having a conversation inside his head that he cannot afford to have out loud. His publicist tried twice to go over talking points for the interview. Dean nodded both times without hearing a word. At 4:50 p.m., Johnny knocked on the green room door. He came in alone, no producers, no assistants, which was also unusual enough that the stage manager standing in the hallway made a note of it without knowing why. The door closed behind him. What happened in that green room for the next 30 minutes, no one can say with certainty. Johnny never spoke about it in specific terms. Dean never spoke about it at all. But Carl Hendricks, the stage manager who had pressed his ear to nothing and seen everything in 20 years of live television, said that he walked past that door twice during those 30 minutes and both times he heard the same thing. Silence. Not the silence of two men who have nothing to say to each other. The other kind. The kind that fills a room when two people are sitting inside something too large for words and they both know it, and neither of them is willing to be the first to pretend otherwise. Carl had been in television long enough to know the difference. He walked past the third time at 5:18 p.m. and heard, very briefly, the sound of one man's voice. Low, steady, not carrying through the door with enough clarity to make out words. Just the tone of it. The cadence of someone saying something that needed to be said carefully. He could not tell if it was Dean or Johnny. He kept walking. What the stage manager did observe, when both men emerged at 5:20 p.m., was that Johnny looked the way he sometimes looked after genuinely difficult conversations, focused, inward, the professional composure slightly more deliberate than usual, as if it required more maintenance than normal. And Dean looked like a man who had made a decision. Not a difficult decision. Not a reluctant one. The kind of decision that has already been made in a deeper part of you for a long time, and what you have just done is simply accept that the moment has arrived. The show began at 5:30 p.m. Johnny's monologue that night was, by every account, exceptional. Sharp, confident, the timing immaculate. The audience was warm and responsive. Ed McMahon laughed in all the right places, which he did not always bother to do when the cameras weren't pointing at him. By 6:10 p.m., Ed's voice filled the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, the king of cool. The chairman of the board's best friend. The man who made relaxed into an art form. Please welcome Dean Martin. The audience rose before he reached the curtain. And Dean Martin walked out exactly the way Dean Martin always walked out, loose, unhurried, grinning at the applause like a man who finds it slightly amusing that rooms full of people stand up when he enters them. He shook Johnny's hand, settled into the chair with the particular grace that was entirely his own, and crossed one leg over the other with the casual ease of a man who has been comfortable in his own skin for so long that comfort itself has become invisible. The audience loved it. The next 24 minutes were, by every measure, a masterpiece of what these two men did together. They talked about a film Dean was finishing. They talked, briefly and hilariously, about golf, a shared obsession that produced in both men an entirely specific kind of outrage. Dean did an impression of Frank Sinatra ordering food at a diner that had the studio crew laughing hard enough to be audible on the broadcast recording. Johnny was leaning back, relaxed, genuinely enjoying himself. This was always the quality that people who watched carefully would notice, that with Dean, Johnny didn't perform enjoyment. He just had it. And then, at 6:34 p.m., 24 minutes and 18 seconds into the interview, at a moment when the energy in the studio was high and easy and everything was going exactly as it was supposed to go, Johnny Carson went off script. He would not be able to explain it afterward. Not satisfactorily, anyway. He had said, in the one conversation he ever had about that moment, a conversation with a journalist's friend, off the record, never published in his lifetime, that it came from somewhere he couldn't locate. A feeling that something was being left unsaid. That underneath the laughter and the golf impressions and the warmth of 22 years, there was something that Dean had come to say and was running out of runway to say it. Johnny looked at his note cards. He set them face down on the desk. And he asked Dean about his son. Not about Dean's career. Not about an upcoming project. Not about anything that was on any note card, in any production meeting, in any pre-interview discussion. He asked about Dino Jr. Dean Martin Jr., Dino, as his family called him, was 20 years old in 1976. He had followed his father's cultural gravity into entertainment, into the public life that was the only life he had ever known. He was in the Air National Guard. He had his father's face and his father's name and the particular weight that comes from carrying both of those things through a world that had already decided who you were before you had the chance to figure it out yourself. That weight was something Dean thought about more than he ever let on. He had watched his son navigate the impossible geometry of being the child of a legend. The way every room Dino entered had already formed an opinion about him before he opened his mouth. The way every success was measured against a standard that had nothing to do with who Dino actually was. The way the name that opened every door also made it harder to know, once you were inside, whether you had earned your place there or simply inherited it. Dean had never spoken about this publicly. Not in any interview, not in any profile, not in the long warm conversations he gave to journalists who had followed his career for decades. It was one of the places where the private man and the public one maintained an absolute border. But Johnny had caught glimpses of it. In small moments over the years, a pause when Dino's name came up in conversation, a particular quality of attention when someone mentioned his son's career, the way Dean's eyes went somewhere else for just a second before he smiled and changed the subject. Those glimpses were part of why the question came out of Johnny the way it did. Not from the note cards. Not from any professional calculation. From 22 years of paying attention. Johnny asked, quietly, Gently, the way a man asks a question when he is not entirely sure he should be asking it but asks it anyway because something tells him it matters. "How's Dino doing, Dean? How's your boy?" The studio did not go quiet immediately. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when the temperature drops, gradually, then all at once. The audience felt something shift without being able to name what had shifted. The laughter that had been present like a fourth person in the conversation simply left the room. Dean Martin looked at Johnny Carson. And for 12 seconds on live national television, he said nothing at all. The camera operator, a man named Louis Ferraro who had worked The Tonight Show for 8 years, said afterward that he zoomed in on Dean's face because something in his body told him to. Not a direction from the control room. Not professional instinct. Something else entirely. What he saw through the viewfinder stopped him. Dean Martin's expression in those 12 seconds was not the expression of a man caught off guard. It was not the expression of a man searching for words. It was the expression of a man who had too many words stacked up behind his eyes, too heavy and too numerous to move. It was the expression of a man looking at the door he had been standing in front of for a very long time, and deciding whether to open it. Ed McMahon would say, in a private conversation 3 years later, that those 12 seconds were the longest of his professional life. Not because they were awkward, they were far past awkward, but because the silence had a quality to it that he had never encountered on a set before or since. It was the quality of something true that is about to be spoken for the first time. The quality of a thing that cannot be unsaid. When Dean Martin finally spoke, he leaned forward very slightly in his chair. His voice dropped below its usual register. Below the warmth, below the performance, below the version of Dean Martin that 22 million people had grown up knowing. And he said 4 words. "I worry about him." Not a sentence with a past tense. Not a sentence with a story attached to it. Just 4 words in the present tense, spoken with a quietness and a directness that had no artifice in them at all. "I worry about him." Johnny heard them. And Johnny went completely still. Later, years later, in that single off-record conversation, Johnny would try to describe what happened to him in the moment he heard those words. He said it was not sadness, exactly. Not pity. Not the professional empathy he had learned to deploy during difficult interviews. He said it was recognition. The same thing he had felt on that back porch in 1954, when Dean had talked about his father and Johnny had said just enough about his mother. The feeling of being let into a room that most people never see. Only this time the room was dark. What happened next has been described differently by every person in that studio who witnessed it. Some said Johnny reached for his note cards and then put them back. Some said he started to speak and stopped. The audio engineer in the control room said the microphone picked up the beginning of a word, a syllable, nothing more, before Johnny closed his mouth. What everyone agrees on is this. Johnny Carson looked at Dean Martin for a long moment. And then he did something he had never done in 16 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He apologized for asking. Quietly. Without explanation. He looked at Dean and he said, "I'm sorry," and he picked up his note cards, and he found the next question, and he moved the interview forward with the particular gentleness of a man who knows he has just touched something that was not his to touch. Dean nodded once. The smile came back. These came back. The performance reassembled itself the way performances do, quickly, completely, with no visible seams. The remaining 9 minutes of the interview were technically fine. But they were not what the 24 minutes before had been. They were 2 professionals completing a task. And everyone in the studio felt the difference, even if nobody could have said exactly when the warmth had left the room or where it had gone. Ed McMahon felt it most acutely. He had sat to Johnny's left for 15 years. He knew Johnny's rhythms the way a musician knows a song they have played 10,000 times, not consciously, not intellectually, but in the body, in the instinctive awareness of where the next note is supposed to land. And for the last 9 minutes of that interview, the notes were landing in all the right places and something was still missing. After the show, Ed found Johnny in the hallway outside the dressing rooms. He didn't ask what had happened. He'd been in television too long to ask questions that people weren't ready to answer. He just put his hand on Johnny's shoulder and stood there for a moment, which was its own kind of language between men of a certain generation. Johnny looked at him. He said, "I think I made a mistake tonight, Ed." Ed said, "On camera?" Johnny said, "No. Worse." He didn't elaborate. Ed didn't press. They had been colleagues long enough to know the difference between a conversation that was ready to be had and one that wasn't. The stage crew finished their breakdown in near silence. The lighting director said later that the entire crew felt it, that specific atmospheric shift that happens in a television studio when something has occurred that doesn't fit into any of the categories that television was designed to contain. Nobody was sad, exactly. Nobody was troubled. It was more like the feeling you get when you've witnessed something that you don't yet have the language to describe, and you know that the language will come eventually, but not tonight. After the taping, Dean did not go to Johnny's dressing room. In 11 previous appearances, he had always gone to Johnny's dressing room. They would sit for 20, 30, sometimes 40 minutes, long enough to make the producers nervous about the crew overtime. That night, Dean shook hands with Fred de Cordova, said something kind to 2 of the camera operators, and left the building at 7:04 p.m. Johnny stood at the edge of the stage for a long time after the studio had emptied. The stage manager, Carl Hendricks, was doing final checks when he noticed Johnny still standing there. He considered saying something. He decided not to. Some silences you don't interrupt. Johnny called Dean's home that night. The call went unanswered. He called again 2 days later. And 3 days after that. He sent a note, handwritten, not through his office, in the first week of November. Dean never responded. Not with cruelty, not with explanation. Simply with the particular silence of a man who has said the most important thing he had to say and has nothing left that he knows how to give. For years, the people who knew about that night understood it as a friendship that had simply run its course. Hollywood was full of those relationships that burned bright and long and then simply ended, the way all things end, not with drama but with distance, not with a door slamming but with a door that stays quietly closed. Johnny understood it differently. Johnny understood it as a message. He could not have told you what the message was, exactly. He carried Dean's 4 words with him the way you carry a splinter, aware of them, unable to remove them, slowly understanding that the irritation is not random, but is pointing at something specific. I worry about him. Present tense. Not the way a father talks about a general concern. The way a father talks when the concern has a shape, a weight, a specific shadow that he has been watching gather on the horizon and cannot find a way to speak about without making it real. Johnny thought about it in 1977. He thought about it in 1978, when he interviewed someone who had worked with Dino Jr. and had to keep his face professional and neutral while something tightened in his chest. He thought about it in 1979 and 1980 and through all the years that Dean Martin and Dean Martin's son continued to exist in the world, visible, alive, present, and Johnny continued to carry 4 words that he could not decipher and could not put down. There was a period, 2 years, maybe 3, when Johnny convinced himself that he had been wrong. That the 4 words were simply a father's ordinary worry about a son navigating a difficult world, and that he had inflated them into something mythological because of the circumstances in which they were spoken. A live studio, a moment of silence, the particular intimacy of 2 old friends with 20 years of history between them. Of course it had felt weighted. Of course it had seemed to carry more than 4 words could carry. That was the nature of those moments. The setting amplified everything. He would reach this conclusion around 1981, and hold it for 6 or 8 months, and then something would happen, a news segment about a military training accident, a photograph of Dino in a newspaper, a particular quality of light in a late afternoon that reminded him, for no reason he could identify, of a television studio, and the 4 words would be there again, as heavy as they had ever been. He sent a Christmas card to Dean every year. They were never acknowledged. He sent one in 1984. In 1985. in 1986. Each year he wrote less inside them. Not because he had less to say, but because he understood, somewhere below the level of articulation, that the silence was not accidental. Dean had gone quiet on purpose. And the kindest thing Johnny could do, the most respectful thing, was to keep sending the cards without demanding a response. To say, in the only language still available to them, "I'm still here. I haven't forgotten. And I'm not asking you to explain." And then came March 21, 1987. Dino Martin Jr. was 35 years old. He was a captain in the California Air National Guard. He was flying a training mission in a Phantom F-4 jet over the San Bernardino Mountains when the aircraft went down. He did not survive. Johnny Carson received the news the same way the rest of America received it, through a phone call, through a news report, through the particular way grief arrives when it arrives about someone you know at a distance but have thought about for years. He sat in his office at NBC. His assistant said he did not move for a very long time. When he finally spoke, he said only one thing. He knew. Dean knew. Not in any rational sense. Not with any information that could be verified or explained. But in the way that a father sometimes knows things about his children that precede the language of knowing, in the body, in the quiet hours before sleep, in the particular weight of a worry that has graduated from the general to the specific without your being able to say exactly when the change occurred. Dean had known in October of 1976. And he had tried, once, in the only language that felt safe enough, to say it. "I worry about him." 4 words on live television. Said to the one man in the world he trusted enough to say them to, in the one moment when the performance had dropped far enough for the truth to come through. And then he had gone quiet. Because saying it had made it real in a way he couldn't take back. Because giving voice to a fear sometimes feels like giving it permission. Because some fathers carry their worst fears in absolute silence, convinced that silence is the only wall left between the fear and the thing itself. Dean Martin never recovered from the death of his son. Those who knew him said he became a different person after March of 1987, quieter, slower, the energy that had seemed inexhaustible simply gone. He retreated from public life in a way that felt less like a choice and more like a tide going out. He canceled the tour he had been scheduled to do with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. He canceled it without a public explanation that satisfied anyone, though the people who knew him understood perfectly. He simply could not put the mask back on. Not at the level that a tour required. Not with the lights and the crowds and the expectation that he would be, for 2 hours every night, the man who made the whole world feel like a party. He ate alone more than anyone around him had ever seen. He went to a small Italian restaurant in Beverly Hills, a place he had been going for 20 years, and sat at the same table in the back and ordered the same things and stayed for hours, not reading, not talking on the phone, just sitting. The owner, a man named Angelo who had known Dean since the 60s, told a reporter years later that he would sometimes look over and find Dean staring at nothing with an expression that he could only describe as a man trying to remember something important that he could no longer quite reach. The laugh was still there, occasionally. The charm was still there. These things were too deeply built into him to disappear entirely. But they were like furniture in a house where someone had stopped living, still present, still functional, but no longer animated by anything from the inside. He died 8 years later, on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 78 years old. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992. In the weeks and months that followed, tribute after tribute arrived, from presidents, from colleagues, from comedians who had learned everything they knew from watching him work. In a private interview, never intended for publication, a journalist asked Johnny about the moment he regretted most in 30 years of hosting. Johnny was quiet for a long time. He said, "There was a night in 1976 when a friend told me something true. And instead of staying with it, instead of sitting in it the way it deserved, I apologized and moved on. I picked up my note cards and I did my job. I moved the conversation forward because that was what I was supposed to do. I have thought about those 4 words every single day since March of 1987. I think about what I should have done. I think about what the conversation might have been if I had simply put the note cards down and stayed. If I had let the silence be what it needed to be. I think Dean came to that studio that night to talk about his son. Really talk. The way we used to talk, before we were famous, before any of this. The way two people talk when one of them is carrying something too heavy to carry alone. And I gave him 12 seconds, and then I apologized and moved on. I gave him the professional version of myself when he needed the real one. And I have never forgiven myself for that. Not entirely. Not even close. Johnny Carson passed away on January 23, 2005. He was 79 years old. Among his personal effects, his family found a single index card in the drawer of his nightstand. Not a note card from any broadcast, not a joke, not a punch line. 4 words. Written in Johnny's handwriting. I worry about him. Below it, in smaller letters, a single line. I should have stayed. There are 12 seconds of silence in the Tonight Show archives that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. 12 seconds in which Dean Martin looked at Johnny Carson and said the truest thing he knew how to say. And the world kept moving. The way it always does. The way it always does when we say the most important things too quietly, in the wrong rooms, in the borrowed language of performance when what we needed was the plain language of truth. There is someone in your life right now who is carrying something they don't know how to say. You can feel it. The shift in the room. The sentence that stops a half-beat before it's finished. The smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Put down your note cards. Stay in the silence. Ask the question you almost didn't ask. And when they answer, when they give you something real and heavy and true, do not apologize for asking. Do not move on. Just stay. That is the whole job. That is all any of us are here to do. If this story reached you tonight, if it reminded you of a conversation you didn't finish, a question you didn't ask, a silence you moved through too quickly, then share it. With someone who is carrying something. With someone who needs to know it's safe to say the hard thing out loud. Subscribe so you don't miss these stories. And drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about a conversation you wish you'd stayed in longer. Tell me about the person in your life who says I worry about him and means something so much larger and darker and more important than those 4 words can hold. Tell me. I'm listening. And I'm not moving on.